Welcome. Good late morning to you all. We're so glad that you could be with us for this religious commitments to SDGs, focusing on children, hunger, water, and sanitation. My name is Adam Nicholas Phillips, and I'm the director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at USAID. I want to thank everyone from the G20 Interfaith Forum who helped organize today's event. It's extraordinary to see what is possible when we can come together around our shared values and goals. I know many of you in the room. I've valued the contributions you've made in the realm of peace building, advocacy, humanitarian assistance, debt relief, global health, and more. For those I haven't met yet, my background is in pastoral ministry, advocacy, campaign work, and policy with many broad-based, locally led initiatives across the globe. In a way, I first cut my teeth nearly 2 decades ago now, working to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And a lifetime of witness to this tremendous impact of religious leaders and organizations has compelled me to join the Biden-Harris administration and USAID in this moment, to do my part to strengthen our engagement with faith-based groups as they respond to the unprecedented crises facing the vulnerable today. USAID's engagement with communities of faith is not new. It's a legacy that dates back over 60 years to September this month, 1961, when U.S. President John F. Kennedy signed the Foreign Assistance Act into law. The act mandated the establishment of a single agency that would coordinate the U.S. government's foreign relief efforts at USAID. President Kennedy turned his attention that year to focus on the Food for Peace program, started by President Dwight D. Eisenhower to continue tackling growing issues of hunger and malnutrition on a global scale. 40 years later, in 2001, President George W. Bush institutionalized the U.S. government's capacity to continue this work through the creation of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, a network of federal centers charged with partnering with faith-based social service providers to better serve the poor. That network, which includes my office at USAID that I lead today, has been reestablished by every president in some capacity for the last 20 years, a thread in the fabric of our democracy, running across decades and throughout administrations on a range of interconnected challenges. Our work with communities of faith represents our commitment to an inclusive, integrative approach to make the world a better place. President Biden, on February 14th of this year, signed an executive order that both reestablished the network of faith-based offices and expanded its mandate to partner with faith-based and local community groups on new issues we face. So as we set our face together to beat back tides of hatred and racism, seek resilience and climate action, to ending COVID-19 and securing human rights around the world, we are learning from our faith-based partners like you in this room and at this forum here in Bologna this week at every step. In this way, we are inspired to weave together a pattern that embraces pluralism and extends dignity to every person around the world. Dignity begins with meeting basic necessities of people, confronting child hunger, as we see in goal number 2 of the SDGs, and ensuring clean water and sanitation like we see in goal 6. These fundamental needs are reflected in the values of the Biden-Harris administration's agenda to build back better. It starts with meeting the basic necessities people need to thrive: clean water, quality education, decent work, food security for all. Here at the G20 Interfaith Forum, our commitment to these values will be manifested not only in our affirmation of these sentiments, but by our ability to take action on them. Our short time together this week must drive us to discover new modalities of action and stir us to invent new paradigms for partnerships between governments and communities that can help us ensure these commitments become reality for our neighbors in need around the world. In essence, to dream up ways to take action to build back better, together. At USAID, we are taking action to address COVID-19, clean water access, and child protection issues as interrelated challenges that are inherently tied to matters pertaining to human dignity. Access to clean water and sanitation, particularly in healthcare facilities, is a significant factor in providing safe healing spaces for millions around the world. The ability of WASH services is closely tied to perceptions that healthcare is dignified and respectful. According to the global What Women Want survey, women and girls wanted access to clean water and sanitary facilities, including toilets through health facilities, ranging from labor rooms to hospital beds. As the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, WASH in health facilities is also a major factor in creating a safe work environment by protecting health workers, staff, and patients alike from infectious diseases and healthcare-acquired infections. Lack of access to clean water, compounded by the pandemic, has resulted in serious risks to the safety and well-being of children, including impacts on their health and education outcomes, as well as increased risk of violence, child abuse, exploitation, neglect, psychosocial distress, and trauma. We know that when any one of these things occur in the life of a child, the impact can have lifelong effects. USAID is working to address this through increasing child protection, positive parenting, and family strengthening interventions to not only improve outcomes from children, but also mitigate the negative impacts of COVID-19 on both health outcomes and economic recovery. Maybe you've seen a recent Lancet article that describes approximately how over now 1.5 million children at least have lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. These figures are grim reminders, that the effects of the virus will impact the general population for years to come. We must think about the secondary effects of COVID, not just vaccine distribution, not just virus prevention, but the secondary effects that keep rolling and rolling, and that will impact us all. However, the vast majority of these children, these orphans, might have a surviving parent or caregiver, and it's critical to provide economic and social support to them, rather than rushing to institutionalized care solutions. This support is also critical for extended family members or kinship carers who take in children when both parents have died. Far too many children end up in orphanages because of poverty, not because they lack living adult family members who love them. COVID-19 also threatens to reverse a decade of global nutrition progress and has put millions more at risk. Current projections estimate that by 2022, next year, an additional 13.6 million children could suffer from wasting or acute malnutrition, and 3.6 million more children could face stunted growth that limits their lifelong potential. Over the last 6 months, I've said time and again how COVID-19 has made us all acutely aware of how connected we are to one another. Never before in history have we been presented with the extraordinary global challenges we face today. We're seeing famine-like conditions not seen in the Horn of Africa in nearly 3 decades. We are bearing witness to gut-wrenching scenes of uprooted families and communities fleeing conflict, violence, and autocratic rule across the world. And in every corner of the world, from Germany and Greece to Madagascar and Thailand, even back on the west coast of the United States where I am from, we're experiencing the ever-present reality of a planet shouldering the weight of unbearable climate change. And perhaps worst of all, this pandemic that undergirds this entire forum, that knows no borders and continues to rage. We think of the many from the global south that aren't with us today, and we must ensure that we redouble our efforts to hear their voices, their stories, and center their leadership as we face these challenges. I think that when we look around the world at this moment, we see that in many ways the pandemic has both set back our shared goals, as well as revealed how much more work we have always had to do. We have felt our own frailty and interconnectedness in these compounding crises. It's a grief upon grief. But through moments that surface our shared grief, the global community has cultivated a sense of purpose, that there be a common cause to a new future. That common cause reminds me that the creation of a tapestry requires extraordinary competence, attention to detail, intricacy, and even repetition. When completed, it symbolizes a lifetime of work. Lifetimes of work is represented in this room. It holds diverse layers together and portrays a picture meant to move and inspire its audience. And so, I'm hopeful for the unfolding that will result as a result of this forum. I know that we are all still weaving together a story. As we partner together on a shared path, may we perhaps be collectively inspired by President Biden's mandate for our office, to bring people of all backgrounds and beliefs together to meet our challenges, perfect our union, and restore the soul of the country and our world. I'm really grateful for this panel of tremendous leaders, many of them that I've gotten to know in my first 6 months in office. First, we will hear from Rudelmar Bueno de Faria, General Secretary of ACT Alliance. Rudelmar.
Thank you very much, Adam. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be in this very important panel talking on a very important topic, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. But much more importantly, the commitment of religious commitment to the SDGs. It's always good and also encouraging to see faith actors occupying political spaces and platforms to contribute to an agenda for humanity. And that was the case when the framework was established back in 2015. Many religious organizations have been engaging that. Myself, I was working with the World Council of Churches in New York, in the UN setup. I personally have been even involved in one of the working groups that were working on the indicators for this, one of the goals of the framework. So we know that faith-based organizations have been involved in that, which is still the main platform for sustainable development. We do not have any other. That is the most comprehensive platform, the political platform for sustainable development. Despite knowing that faith actors and organizations sometimes have different views on the 2030 agenda as a concept, without mentioning the opposing views on the scope of some of the SDGs, like gender equality, for instance, in terms of embracing the universality and the indivisibility of the gender equality. I'm saying that because we should not be romantic, but rather pragmatic on the religious commitment to the SDGs. They exist, but we need to take that in a different perspectives as well. But as Adam mentioned, we cannot talk about the SDGs without framing it in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has surfaced and exacerbated the dysfunctionalities of a society that was already in crisis, a normal that was already in crisis in most of our societies, in all the regions, and especially the shocking economic and social inequalities and the persistent discriminations such as racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and misogyny. It had and continued to have implications for humanity, societies, organizations, and that's not sparing faith-based organizations, religious organizations. So one of the points for that is that we cannot advance the sustainable development goals if we will not address issues of inequalities. And that's not only for religious organizations, it's for everyone. We know that the rapid and changing political, social, cultural, and economic context have posed challenges to humanity, but also to organizations and institutions that strive to uphold human rights, promote justice, and address inequalities in the world today. In the religious, we talk about social justice. All the religions embrace that as part of the values, of the religious values. But also we know that we are having a lot of challenges. And the biggest one is the confluence of fundamentalisms, the religious, the economic, and the political fundamentalisms that at certain extent are redefining values in our societies, are realigning institutions that in the past were opposing. They are now together to undermine human rights, pushing people and nations to very dangerous positions, as we see in the context of polarization, extreme nationalistic approaches, and also hate speeches. As the COVID-19 pandemic shows, all countries' health and wellness follow a social gradient. The lower the socioeconomic positions, the worse the health. And you saw that before even the pandemic, how the health systems were working or not working everywhere. And the differentiated and intersectional impact become much more glaring when we zoom into specific thematic areas such as humanitarian assistance, climate change, gender justice, migration and displacement, and peace and human security. The focus of this panel today is to be about children, water and sanitation, and hunger. You saw that in the program. So I think that many of the catastrophes across the world today are increasingly related to climate change. And that is basically the key driver of poverty and an inhibitor for sustainable development, causing loss of lives, as you know, income and damage to properties, exacerbating population displacement and conflicts, and also all the issues related to sea levels rising and so on. But one aspect that is related to climate change is also right to water. We know that water will be the major issue in the future in terms of conflicts. And we need to have a right approach for that in terms of access management. That is a God gift to humanity. It's not a commodity. It's a common good for humanity. In terms of hunger, I think that Adam already mentioned that, but WFP released the figures of the 2020 situation in terms of undernourished people in the world. 10% of the people in the planet, they are not getting the food that they need every day. And the pandemic has exacerbated and disrupted even more that the economies, the job markets, and the supply chains, and have also inflated the food prices. And even more people are experiencing moderate and severe food insecurity, meaning that they do not consistently have, as I mentioned, food for every day. And children especially, we know that more likely will die before reaching maturity. There is a big number of that expressed also in the WFP reports. Those who survive may also face some health and cognitive disadvantages throughout their lives. So that's a very clear thing. And talking about children as well, I know that my time is very short. There is also the digital divide. I'm thinking in terms of homeschooling, where most of the countries are using that as a way. And we know that the majority, the vast majority of the children in the world today do not have access to the technology, to the internet. And that is increasing the inequalities and the divide between richer and poorest people. Gender inequality, we cannot stop, not to talk about that, because that's, before the pandemic, it was already one of the biggest problems in terms of violence against human rights, women's rights. And with the pandemic, the situation is much more complicated now, domestic violence. But the other element is the setback, the pushback that exists today because of this confluence of fundamentalisms in terms of putting the women's rights even far behind. And that's how we will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, when gender is one of the fundamental elements for us to achieve all the SDGs. And therefore, I would like to make the point that it's the significance of individual religious identities to those endangered by these conflicts and situations, the role of local faith communities, and the influence of local faith leaders are increasingly understood to be important components to address these situations, support sustainable development, and delivering of effective humanitarian assistance. And faith-based organizations, I will not, you know that, they are one of the major actors in terms of supporting that, in terms of being the first responding in humanitarian situations, community resilience, supporting development processes. And we know that the faith leaders are trusted community leaders, and they have a strong influence on the life of people. And we need to work with the faith communities. And especially when we know that around, according to estimations, 84% of the populations recognize themselves with a faith or a religion. So I think that we need to, as faith-based organizations, as religious communities, to highlight the unique value that we have in terms of engaging in these processes. And that's, it's critically important that we engage in ecumenical, but in multi-faith inspired political and programmatic spaces, supporting climate change initiatives and engaging in partnerships that mobilize the moral and ethical imperative for global solidarity with people and communities affected by injustices and supporting them. We are in a key position at faith-based organizations. But one thing that we need to have very clear is that we will only be able to do that if we will address the root causes of injustice, vulnerability, and poverty. And it's crucial to engage in coordinated advocacy for justice and dignity for all at local, regional, and global levels. And for religious leaders, for us, it's about to be prophetic. When we mention to address the root causes of injustices, it's about prophecy. And that means that we need to denounce injustices and denounce the good news. That means advocacy against those elements and root causes, but also actions to be able to deliver what we want. I do not know about my time, but I'm going to conclude soon. The importance of fostering partnership with different stakeholders is an urgent need rather than an option for faith communities. we have a unique window of opportunity to build a new social contract that honors the dignity of every human being, and we cannot ignore the opportunities that for faith-based organizations to offer insights in those spaces that are defining the future of humanity, politically, through policies, through actions. So, but for that, of course, we need to understand the nexus between religion and development. That's very important. That has been, of course, part of the secular religious debate for many, many years. But often religion has been ignored and sidelined in international development strategies and cooperations. And despite in the last decades or so, especially the UN, United Nations have been engaging very much with faith actors to provide these aspects. And finally, I would not like to conclude without mention one topic that I heard, and that was Dr. Agsa Karan mentioned in the events that we had yesterday about the accountability. You know, faith-based organizations and civil society organizations, we are very strong in claiming that governments need to be accountable for the actions. But we need also in the faith communities to consider our accountability. When we mention about commitment to the SDGs, how we will hold ourselves accountable to this commitment and the actions that we need to do. But there is a hope, and I hope that that will be the way how faith-based communities together with the entire international community will be able to advance the 2030 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudelmar. I'd like to now introduce Sharon Eubank, first counselor in the Presidency of the Relief Society of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Sharon.
I'm very happy to have shared the table with these friends. We're tight here, so we feel very close. Thanks for Adam for your remarks, and especially for Rudelmar. Many of these people in the room and at the table are my friends, and I'm grateful. As Adam said, my name is Sharon Eubank. I represent Latter-day Saint Charities, which is the humanitarian arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But as a faith-based organization, we can do nothing without the partnership of the others here, so I'm very grateful to highlight some of the work. I hope that you won't mind that I brought some slides, because as we talk about the effects of the pandemic on poverty and particularly on hunger, I wanted to demonstrate some of this. We've alluded to it, but I just want to show some statistics if you won't mind. So many times the Sustainable Development Goals get overshadowed by an emergency. You know, you have these goals that we're working on as a priority for 10 years, but emergencies tend to overtake that. And I just wanted to show okay. So of the 17 goals, 3 of them are particularly helpful for what we're talking about today, and Rudelmar talked about this already. Number 1, no poverty. Number 2, zero hunger. And number 6, clean water and sanitation. And although we could talk all day about those, I wanted particularly to talk about hunger. It is the most pressing, and there are some quite interesting developments that are going on toward that. So I'd love to just talk about those today. This statistic is interesting. Despite international efforts and improvements in other areas of global development, world hunger has been on the increase since 2014. Now, the pandemic made it much worse. If current trends continue, the number of hungry people could reach 840 million by 2030. That is a staggering number for the 21st century where we are. I bring this map, and you look at this map, and you can see the yellow is maybe the best, well, the blue is the best condition, then it goes to green and yellow, and you see the dark red places which are the most at risk. But I want to point out, when you look at that, yellow still represents 15% of hunger. That's bad even on its own. And so when we look at that map, I don't take very much comfort in that. In the 21st century, we ought to be able to do better. I want to give a little bit of information about why COVID has exacerbated the hunger situation. Now, the topic today was, in the face of the worsening situation, how can religious actors revamp and revitalize the agenda and overcome the globalization of indifference toward those who suffer? So that's kind of where I'm trying to head here. There are 3 statistics that capture the impact of this for me very vividly. The first one is 1 in 3 children under 5 are hungry. The second one is 45% of child deaths are related to undernutrition. And the third one, in 2/3 of countries, women are more likely to be hungry than men. So that sort of sets the parameters of what we're talking about. The reasons for hunger are not always straightforward, and you alluded to some of these, but they are food supply chain inefficiencies. We've seen very strong examples of that even in developed countries as the pandemic has gone forward. Gender inequality, climate change, disease, including the pandemic, and conflict. And probably conflict contributes the most. I won't, this is a very busy slide, but let me just point out that in 2019, there were 135 million people at risk of acute hunger. Acute hunger means you are actively starving to death. This isn't chronic hunger, that people just have periods of hunger. Since the pandemic started, so 2 years later, that number has doubled to 272 million. I don't know if we can appreciate the scope of what that actually represents. And the other one I wanted to highlight is, because of the pandemic, an additional 9.3 million children under the age of 5 will experience wasting, meaning their muscle mass is going backwards rather than forwards. This is an additional 9.3 million. We think about the very hungriest places on the world, and Yemen, of course, is an example. Madagascar is another example. 10% of children in southern Madagascar are wasting, as I talked about. But just the report yesterday is highlighting Afghanistan. Because of what has happened there, there's 1 million people at risk of dying before the end of the year. This is just talks about how difficult the situation is right now. Like climate change, like the disasters that are happening, weather disasters so quickly, they're happening bigger, they're happening faster, and they cannot be addressed without cooperation. So I think the days of us trying to tackle something on our own are past. We have to be able to coordinate with each other, which is why the forum like this is so important. I show this picture because so often where we get involved in food aid is right here. Is a hungry child, and aid comes in the form of whatever it is, plumpy nut or whatever, but aid is given to that child. This is controversial to say, but we need to stop getting involved at the end, right here, when it's hit the news and it's a catastrophe. This is the place where we ought to be focusing on, instead of food aid, but on food development. This is a family, they're in Ghana. Their community has bought this little grinder, and they're grinding their cassava flour. And the best thing about this is it gives them a week's security. They can keep flour at home for a week with this communal grinder that they all belong to. That grinder probably costs the cost of about 10 meals, 10 emergency meals by the time you factor in the distribution getting it there. That has so much more to do with food security. But because of the emergencies and because of the crises and the emotional feeling of when everything is exploding, we spend our attention and we spend our money on food aid. My plea today is to back up and try to intervene before it hits the news on this food development earlier on. Do you know what the biggest predictor is of whether a child will be hungry? It's not what you think. It's whether they have 2 parents in their home. And you can feel the things that contribute to that. One parent leaves, goes to make money, sends money back, the marriage gets strained, and all of those things create stress and hunger on children. I want to highlight 3 things that Latter-day Saint Charities and its faith group network have tried to change and revamp since the pandemic started. We're in the middle of these. I wouldn't say that they're total successes, but I want to highlight some of the things that we've had to do to change. The World Food Program has the best distribution center in the world, and they have a system of hubs and spokes. So right now they have 3 global hubs, and they have 5 regional hubs, and then they have spokes that go out to places that you can predict where emergencies are going to be. The pandemic taught us we've always been very efficient in our global supply, but we've learned through the pandemic we need to be efficient, but we also have to be redundant, because something like the pandemic comes along and it cuts off that very efficient supply chain that you have, and then suddenly we've been left with nothing else. Latter-day Saint Charities invested $2 million in World Food Program's Hub and Spoke program to strengthen it during the pandemic. And they've moved 45,000 tons of goods through that hub and spoke system in the last 2 or 3 months. It's getting vaccine supplies, it's getting food, it's moving things along. But as we invested in that, we learned we should be doing this at every level of our distribution chain. So for small congregational projects that they're working on, or regional things or national things, we've started talking about we want to be efficient in our distribution and we want to be redundant in our distribution. I bring this up because the benefit of local faith communities is they often have different distribution systems. And so if they cooperate with each other, you get that redundancy along with the efficiency. The second thing I wanted to highlight is women as agriculture leaders. Because we looked earlier that women are more at risk to be hungry, and they often control the food or the food choices that are being made for the family, it's critical that women become involved in agriculture. They do most of the work. They own hardly any of the land. These are issues about equity that have to be addressed. Let me just highlight a little program. Latter-day Saint Charities, ADRA, Catholic Relief, IsraAid, Rahma Worldwide, and Rise and Rebuild. That coalition of faith-based organizations has started promoting these peer groups of women farmers. So the woman you see in the black shirt is named Beatrice. She's a farm-based advisor. And her peer group, she goes out and negotiates for seeds, she negotiates for fertilizer, and then those women support each other and help each other. When the pandemic started, Beatrice was also asked by the Ministry of Health in Zambia to bring information about COVID-19 to her peer group. And so this isn't just about farming and seeds and income production, but it also transmits health information. Why does that work? Because they know each other. They're their neighbors, they belong to different faiths in their community, and they trust each other. And it turns out that trusting relationships are as important as the money or the food or anything else. And the most trusting relationships come through faith-based or through faith communities. Faith communities working together in these mixed religious groups, we've started to create these local citizen councils, and they have a shared purpose. And in this case, it's about food. And they forge a partnership with the local government. So the faiths come together, they create the council, and then they go to the local government for additional resources. Let me just share some of the things that they're doing with this counseling system. So these are 2 examples. These 3 women are in Paris, and they're working with the immigrant and the migrant communities. These other 2 women are in Qatar and Philippines, but they're both using this council system that I just described. So what they do is they visit the families and they figure out, not we have a goat project and we want to bring it to you, but what is it you want to do, and we'll see if we can help you find some resource to do it. So they find out about their needs and then their goals. Then they let them know about nutritional supplements, deworming medicine, anything that's locally available that could be of use in their family. They screen the children. Many, many children, their parents have no idea that they're underweight and malnourished because they eat something every day, but it's just starch. They're not getting the nutrients that they need so that their brains can develop. Then they share locally developed health and nutrition lessons with these parents. They encourage produce in their daily diet, and then they teach them how to grow a garden or to have small animal production, whatever it is their goal. Those have been around for ages, and that is the heart of development. But the reason it works is because they're working with someone trusted, and it's tailored to the goal of the family. When families have knowledge about these things, and these interventions don't cost very much, they can make better decisions. This is a family in the Philippines, part of that program, father and mother and 2 children. The mother said, "This was a wake-up call for me. I'm a teacher, and I didn't understand that children's brain development stops when they don't have the right nutrients," because her children were just eating rice every day. They felt full, but they weren't having the nutrition that they needed. I want to conclude by just saying the great benefit of the Sustainable Development Goals is to cluster focused attention around critical needs so that we don't forget in the middle of responding to the emergencies these core principles that have to be addressed. Now, the theme for the conference is a time to heal. And I'd like to extend 2 calls as we make recommendations to the G20 that will meet in October in Rome. I'd like to make 2 recommendations for them. The first one is to ask faith communities in their nations for data and progress, as we talked about being accountable, about their work with the Sustainable Development Goals. So ask them for their accountability, for the data and the progress of the things they're working on. I promise they will be surprised at the scope of what's happening with those faith-based organizations. The second one is, please invest aid dollars early on, often best through the faith communities before the crisis is unbearable and it hits the news, and try to create a holistic approach to hunger. Nothing about that is new. Nothing about that is revolutionary. We talk about it. We just don't do it. This is the commitment of Latter-day Saint Charities. It's the commitment of this panel here today. And I hope that every one of us will walk out with that New Testament verse ringing in our ears, I was an hungered, and you gave me meat. And if you can do it unto the least of these, my brethren, you are doing it unto God. And I say that with all my commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. I'd like to now introduce Kirsten Laursen Muth, CEO of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. Kirsten.
Good morning. Thank you to the organizers of this event and to Sherry, our hosts here in Italy. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. And I just want to preface what I'm going to say from with a personal voice. I come to this work as a person of faith, and I am a professional in this field. And when I come to events like this, I look to see how the work that we do is understood by those outside of our faith conversations. And so the remarks that I'm going to be making, I think, will conclude by speaking to what we talk about as faith engagement. The Joint Learning Initiative is a collective organization of 800 plus members, and we work to advance faith engagement through evidence-based work, and I will be using examples of that work in my comments. So what do the SDGs really mean to faith actors? The Keeping Faith in 2030 Religions and the Sustainable Development Goals research report documented that while faith actors were involved in SDG development, it was mostly the ones who were already at the table, usually northern-based actors. How much do local faith actors know about the SDGs? It's a mixed bag. Evidence from Ethiopia and India consultations with national faith actors showed that there was varied knowledge, and many didn't know about the SDGs, but were already doing activities in line with the SDGs. How can our global perspectives better include local faith, and especially local perspectives and priorities? I mention that because faith exists before we defined human rights, before we defined the SDGs, before we defined MDGs. And faith efforts have been working in this area for a long time, so our commitments predate the SDGs. Across the globe, COVID-19 has led many grassroots leaders and faith actors to expand beyond their normal scope of work, adapting existing work and taking on new challenges, such as dealing with misinformation. We have also seen at the same time a significant uptake in multitude of working groups seeking to inform the work of multilaterals, including the WHO. We often see the same actors at these tables. I mention this because I challenge us to widen our tables and to create new tables. Despite the impact they have had over the past 18 months, local faith-based community leaders and organizations have been excluded from, or at least not adequately included in decision-making at the national and international levels. A report from the British Medical Journal of Global Health cites research on the lack of community engagement, including perspectives on non-COVID-19 health and socioeconomic impacts of pandemic response measures at the national level. It underlines the value of formal networking systems, bringing community leaders together as peers, calling for more support and resources for these networks. In last year, JLI launched our Fair and Equitable Initiative, which is our response to anti-racism and decolonized approaches. This initiative seeks to address asymmetries of power in research and knowledge, including our recognition that much of the existing evidence work privileges northern researchers and organizations. The faith world is complex and full of contradictions. We talk of dignity and yet too often remain silent or complicit in the face of harmful behaviors and discrimination. We know that while faith often brings people together, it also leads to divisions. Conflicts can arise or be exacerbated when people from different faiths find it hard to live and work together, and it is the poorest that suffer the most. So we need to keep working to know more about how people from different faiths can come together and work in common purpose. One area of common ground has been improving water and sanitation, as has been mentioned by some of my compatriots up here, as the COVID pandemic has further put public health and sanitation needs in stark view. A progress report on faith-inspired action results in healthcare facilities from June this year cites that 1 in 4 healthcare facilities do not have access to basic water services, and 47 LDCs have it worse, with 50% lacking basic water and 60% lacking basic sanitation. Healthcare workers put themselves at risk and are unable to ensure that they first do no harms. 40 FBOs took up the call to address WASH in healthcare facilities, responding to Global Water 2020. The Catholic Church, as some examples, under Vatican leadership, piloted a program in 23 countries. The African Christian Health Association platform, which is estimated to deliver between 30 and 70% of services across about 5,000 facilities in 32 countries in Africa, distributed small grants to improve facilities. World Vision Salvation Army, itself represented in 131 countries, and many others. The African Council of Religious Leaders convened multi-faith religious leaders from 21 countries and made a unanimous endorsement of a call to action. Here we see the power of collective action for a clear purpose. In terms of children's rights, while the overall picture is that faith actors do significant work, there are those who perpetrate abuse and neglect and the cultures that allow for this. JLI's Learning Hub on Ending Violence Against Children highlights the potential to build on the transformational prophetic potential of faith actors to challenge, transform, and offer positive alternatives to religious, cultural, societal, and gendered beliefs and practices that underlie specific forms of violence against children. There are many examples of this, but in the essence of time, there's the Safer Seek Partnership, every organization is doing some incredible work in this field, World Vision and Channels of Hope, all of that. So moving to hunger, we know that prior to COVID, globalization had decreased poverty, increased food production for a growing global population. Over the same time, however, the timeless wisdom of how to sustain the land has been replaced by extractive industrial models that privilege profit and convenience. Progress is measured by market indices and GDP rather than collective prosperity. The pandemic has now erased many of the gains made from globalization. And while COVID has also made it harder to measure hunger, we know that among other negative impacts, women's risk of severe food insecurity is increasing faster than men's. There is enough food produced in the world to feed everyone on the planet. Small farmers, herders, and fishermen still produce about 70% of the global food supply, yet they remain especially vulnerable to food insecurity. Poverty and hunger are most acute among rural populations, which just underscoring Sharon's point about making investments early on. These are also the people most excluded from decision-making that affects them. During a COVID panel on food and faith responses hosted by JLI and the Berkeley Center, Reverend Nikta of the Organization of African Instituted Churches stated that new visions need not be the priority, as many solid strategies were well defined before the COVID crisis. The OAIC has a clear vision for the future, turning around the congregation as a center of support for production, post-harvest management, organizing cooperatives, and engaging local and national governments. The OAIC works with research institutions to target specific crops that have minerals like zinc and iron, which meet the needs of pregnant and lactating mothers. Earlier in this forum, we have heard mention of indicators of human well-being, which address health, relationships, community, security, purpose, and environment, among others. Acknowledging that most of the world's population claims a faith identity, we could add religion and spirituality. According to Emma Tomlin of Leeds University, studies of the religion development nexus globally reveal that religion is often deeply ingrained in people's vision of what counts as progress, and that this has shaped understandings of development long before the emergence of secular global development discourses. So what needs to happen to make religious commitments to the SDGs successful? The religious commitments have been around longer than the actual commitments have been articulated in various forms articulated now. So what needs to happen? So I want to talk a little bit about deepening and expanding our models of faith engagement, starting with modeling real dialogue. Our spaces need to allow for faith actors and their partners to acknowledge their differences while recognizing the perspectives they share. We need a willingness to learn from each other and to seek the truth rather than seek to be right. A successful dialogue is one where you learn something about yourself, a bias, an assumption, a perhaps newly flexible line in the sand, while at the same time learning more about someone else. Learning more and becoming more aware about your own self is what is going to enable you to understand someone else better. So I just want to talk about that I just think that's really important. We've talked a lot about dialogue, but that exchange is and should be transformational. The Faith and Positive Change for Children initiative is an example of a faith engagement strategy that has taken the time to develop a methodology known as heart-mind dialogue. The initiative is a tripart collaboration between the Joint Learning Initiative, Religions for Peace, and UNICEF. Initially, UNICEF did a global mapping of its work with faith actors, revealing that they have historically partnered through individual sector programs, which led to a siloed approach with often parallel and short-lived efforts. This FPCC initiative advances faith engagement in two ways. It is a long-term commitment, and it's not without its challenges. I will personally tell you that. However, it is authentically trying to do this, and I respect that very much. So the two ways are strengthening the capacities of faith-based communities, networks, and actors in evidence-based, systematic, and integrated approaches to social and behavior change in support of the results for children and families that UNICEF so well prioritizes. Secondly, a theory of change based on principles, guidance, and tools that supports UNICEF country offices to engage more effectively and systemically with faith actors for more holistic and integrated programming, moving away from the ubiquitous message-focused and instrumentalist models. This approach is being rolled out in 8 countries in Africa with planning underway in 4 additional regions. It's complicated, it's underfunded, and it is truly well-intended, and I want you all to know about it. Another approach that I think will support successful faith engagement is advancing public knowledge about religion. We usually speak of religious literacy, and that is very important, but that term may be too narrow and even alienating. We can move away from explicitly religious content to explore broader values and experience that connect rather than exclude. This kind of literacy fosters respectful pluralism. Increasing public awareness and support can help to reduce the secular bias that continues to compromise faith engagement. We can recognize and invite new faith actors to the table beyond religious leaders and faith-inspired development professionals. Faith actors are also economists, business leaders, gender activists, farmers, and lawyers. They are engaged in improving the lives of their communities in myriad ways that can inspire others. And here I want to mention the youth. I wish their sessions could have been a centerpiece of this forum. I think we all would have been re-energized. Youth are the stakeholders of our future, and their voice is key. If they are interested in what we are saying, we are on the right path. Additionally, we can cultivate partnerships with those who manage religious content from a demand rather than a creator perspective. I think working more closely with journalists in the private sector, seeking to reach people about what they want to understand about us rather than what we want them to understand. We can also advocate to advance religious education in schools in order to increase tolerance and pluralism. I also want to add my voice to the calls for accountability, and I'm going to identify two areas of accountability. I think we need to advance specific accountability for localization. The Grand Bargain and the Charter for Change made specific commitments to localization, yet measurements for accountability are both lagging and lacking. Faith actors were key signatories to the Charter of Change and should be leaders in systematizing and reporting on indicators for accountability across transfers in power and resources. We must also advance accountability for global and local faith engagement. Multilateral and other spaces created for faith engagement should be institutionalized and systematically resourced. Faith engagement requires an understanding of history and needs an institutional memory to avoid repetition, redundancy, and ruts. Engagement needs to catalyze specific action, and actions need to be integrated into intersectoral approaches and not siloed. Faith actors can do more to collectively call for more robust mechanisms of faith engagement. I believe in faith engagement. I believe it's not working as well as it should, and that's what my comments are about.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. I'd like to now introduce Peter Prove, Director of International Affairs at the World Council of Churches. Peter.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's an honor to join this distinguished panel and rather exceptionally well gender-balanced panel, which is very pleasant to see. I want to share with you, for the purpose of this discussion, some of the examples by which the World Council of Churches, under the leadership of the General Secretary, Father Johann Salke, who is, I'm pleased to say, present with us in this discussion, how we are trying to engage our global constituency of some 580 million people in pursuing these purposes, in particular, those focuses that frame this discussion in this session: children, hunger, water, and sanitation. Firstly, the Church's commitments to children, which is a plan of action and an open invitation to WCC member churches and partners to address the needs of children as an integral part of the ecumenical commitment to justice and peace, and to the realization of the SDGs for some of society's most vulnerable and important members. This has become the foundation of a WCC program implemented in partnership and in very close partnership with UNICEF. There are three main pillars for joint efforts under this program. One is preventing violence against children and promoting child protection through church communities. Two, promoting meaningful participation in church and society by children and adolescents. And three, addressing some of the particularly critical issues for children in our time, and particularly raising church voices for intergenerational climate justice and supporting climate initiatives by, for, and with children. Another, and I would like to emphasize this as well, another important issue in this regard is the need to acknowledge that many children today, more than at any time since the Second World War, are displaced or refugees who are fleeing from their homes and in special need of protection. Now, currently, around 1,500 churches and partners are actively engaged in the implementation of the Church's commitments to children. We want to contribute more in this respect, embodying the qualities of child-friendly, caring and protecting churches, anchored in solid child safeguarding measures. But we also have to confess that collectively we have fallen short. And the gravity of those failings are all too painfully obvious. So, capacity building is a strong component of the Church's commitments to children projects. For example, the Out of the Shadows resource equips churches with tools to prevent and address child sexual abuse. Another recent publication, Cooler Earth, Higher Benefits, provides resources for church action to respond to the climate crisis that threatens future generations. The second example I'd like to share with you is the Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance Food for Life campaign, hosted by the World Council of Churches. The Food for Life campaign promotes just and sustainable food systems and adequate nutrition through a rights-based approach and enhancing local food systems, and mobilizes action and reflection for food justice and zero hunger. This campaign seeks to educate, inspire, and mobilize faith communities to take action for increased food security and sustainable agriculture in their contexts. It promotes food as a right, a need, and a responsibility, recognizing, for example, that an estimated 1/3 of all food produced is wasted. There is an annual week of action on food, which is a centerpiece of this campaign, through which we seek to broaden and disseminate and widen the engagement in this focus. We have also promoted what we call the 10 Commandments on food, which seek to address the existential challenge of hunger and inequity in an innovative and spiritually engaging manner. The third example I'd like to share is the Ecumenical Water Network, again, an initiative hosted by the World Council of Churches. The Ecumenical Water Network brings together churches and church-related organizations that promote the preservation, responsible management, and equitable distribution of water for all, based on the understanding that water is a gift from God, a common good, and a fundamental human right. Since 2008, the Ecumenical Water Network, through its 7 Weeks for Water annual campaign, has been providing weekly theological reflections and other resources on water for the 7 weeks of the Lenten season and covering World Water Day on the 22nd of March. Through the work of the Ecumenical Water Network, the WCC itself became a blue community in 2016, replacing the sale and use of bottled water in the Ecumenical Center in Geneva with a tap-based network of water distribution fountains. As a blue community, WCC promotes the human right to water, says no to the privatization of water, and works to raise awareness of the problems created by indiscriminate use of disposable plastic bottles and their negative impact on the environment. The Ecumenical Water Network regularly engages in World Water Week, actively supports the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. Since 2017, the network and other partners have trained over 100 young people globally in a 2-week certificate course, the ECHO School on Water, Food, and Climate Change. I want to say a very brief word, beyond these examples, of the importance and the reality of interfaith engagement on SDGs. And we have present in our room representatives of 2 of our leading instruments for promoting that sort of engagement. Dr. Azar Karam, as Secretary General of Religions for Peace, and Khushwant Singh, who is head of the Secretariat of the International Partnership for Religion and Sustainable Development, which brings together governmental, intergovernmental, and faith-based partners from many different religious traditions to work together on the pursuit of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention and I need your support. I know I already have a common cause with the other speakers on this panel regarding an issue of urgent concern, and that is the global hunger and food insecurity crisis, the emergency. Globally, right now, more than 41 million people, around half of them children, are at risk of starvation in some 43 countries. And 584,000 people are currently living in famine-like conditions in Ethiopia, Madagascar, South Sudan, and Yemen. And of course, we've just heard the reports of the looming crisis in Afghanistan. The global hunger crisis is being driven by conflict, by climate change, and by the economic impacts of COVID-19 that have left people even further behind. Immediate action is required to stop people sliding into famine or famine-like conditions and to prevent widespread starvation. We know from past emergencies that around half of the victims of famines perished before an official famine declaration was made. Half of all those that died were children under the age of 5. Funding commitments must be dispersed quickly in order to meet these urgent needs. And additional commitments must be made to support longer-term solutions to food crises. Most urgently, the $8.5 billion committed in the G7 Compact on Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Crises needs to be disbursed without further delay. And it needs to target the 41 million people in those emergency and catastrophe famine levels of food insecurity, with a focus on meeting the nutrition needs of children in their first 1,000 days. The critical window to prevent famine is rapidly closing, and funding must reach those that need it most. Funding must be additional to existing humanitarian funding commitments. It must be new money, and it must not be diverted from the already 35 underfunded humanitarian response plans. Longer-term actions are needed to address the underlying issues that are driving hunger. Support to climate change adaptation for those most affected, livelihood support and COVID-19 recovery assistance and peace building are among the range of programs required to help communities recover, adapt, rebuild, and eventually thrive. Right now, we are preparing a new ecumenical and interreligious initiative to address these issues, and we're going to launch it on World Food Day, 16th of October, to address the urgency of these matters. And I invite all of the faith-based ecumenical and interfaith partners represented in this room to join us in that initiative. I hope, and this is my appeal to all of you who can convey this message, I hope that this G20 Interfaith Forum can actively take up these concerns and demand action of the G20, of the G7, and of all those that have the power to shift this equation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank you for listening. And we may have started late, but look at us. We've ended early. So please go out into Bologna and enjoy your afternoon. And we will see you later today. Be well.